The sun was sinking behind the rolling hills of the open prairie, painting the horizon in streaks of deep gold and bruised purple. The air carried the scent of dust and sagebrush, stirred up by a light wind that whispered across the land. John Mercer, a middle-aged rancher with weathered hands and eyes that had seen more than their share of hardship, was finishing his day's work. His small ranch sat like a lonely outpost against the vast, empty expanse, its wooden fences stretching just far enough to keep in a modest herd of cattle. John was not a man to waste daylight, but that evening something tugged at his senses, something unusual. As he walked toward the barn, he heard it, a faint, irregular sound, half muffled by the wind. It wasn't the lowing of a cow or the creak of wood. It was softer, almost like a groan. He stopped, his hand automatically moving to the colt on his hip. In these parts, caution wasn't just a habit, it was survival. After a moment of silence, he heard it again, coming from beyond the fence line, toward the dry creek bed that cut through the land. Leaving his evening chores unfinished, John crossed the pasture and slipped through the gate, his boots crunching over the hard earth. The wind carried the smell of dust and something else, iron, blood. When he reached the creek bed, the fading light revealed a figure lying in the shallow depression. At first, John thought it was just another unfortunate soul fallen to the merciless prairie. But then he noticed the paint, faded streaks of red and black across the man's face and the elaborate beadwork on his tattered shirt. This was no ordinary traveler. He was a tribal leader. Judging by his attire and the eagle feather still clinging to his hair, the man's chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. A dark stain spread across his side, where an arrow or bullet had torn through. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they locked with John's, a sharp, piercing gaze, even in weakness. John didn't waste time asking what had happened. He knelt beside him, pulling a canteen from his belt and tipping a trickle of water between the man's cracked lips. The leader swallowed with effort, his breath rattling. "You're gonna die out here if I leave you," John muttered. "And I ain't the kind of man to leave anyone for the buzzards." With that, he hooked his arms under the man's shoulders and began the grueling task of hauling him back toward the ranch. The man was taller than John had expected, and heavier too, even in his weakened state. Each step was a battle against the uneven ground, but John pressed on, muttering words of encouragement neither of them really understood. By the time they reached the cabin, night had settled like a heavy blanket over the land. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices carrying through the darkness. John kicked the door open with his boot and half-dragged the man inside, laying him gently on the bed. His cabin was simple: one bed, a rough-hewn table, a few shelves, and a stone fireplace. The place smelled faintly of coffee grounds and saddle leather. Without hesitation, John lit a lamp, its warm glow spilling over the room, and fetched the small wooden box that served as his medicine kit. The wound was bad, deep and ugly, the kind that could turn a strong man to dust in a matter of hours if left untreated. John heated water over the fire, tore strips from an old shirt for bandages, and cleaned the wound as best he could. The tribal leader tensed, but didn't cry out, his jaw clenched in silent endurance. When John was done binding the wound, he set about cooking. There wasn't much, just beans, bread, and a small piece of salted pork, but it was hot and filling. He spooned some beans into a tin bowl and offered them, but the man only looked at him with wary eyes. "Food," John said slowly, tapping the bowl. "Eat." The leader hesitated, then took the spoon and began to eat in small, measured bites. It was a quiet meal, broken only by the crackle of the fire. John didn't press for conversation. He doubted the man spoke much English, and besides, it wasn't his way to pry. When the meal was done, John pulled the thin wool blanket up over the man and set a fresh log on the fire. He didn't take the bed for himself. Instead, he dragged an old rocking chair closer to the hearth, settling into it with his rifle across his knees. He kept an ear out for trouble, his gaze moving between the firelight and the wounded man sleeping fitfully. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the lonely sound of the prairie at night. John thought about the risk he was taking. The man in his bed was likely someone important, and important men had enemies. If those enemies came looking tonight, they might decide to settle scores with the rancher as well. But John didn't believe in turning away those in need. Out here, miles from the nearest town, all a man really had was his word and his sense of right and wrong. Sometime after midnight, the leader stirred, his breathing heavy. His eyes opened, and he studied John for a long time, as though trying to see into the very heart of him. Then, with a slow nod, he closed them again, as if satisfied. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. John sat in silence, the rifle across his lap, keeping watch while the man slept. It was a long night, but in the strange stillness of it, there was also something unspoken. A quiet understanding between two men from different worlds, bound together for the moment by survival. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in pale pink and gold, John rose and added more wood to the fire. The tribal leader was still alive, weak but breathing steadily. That was enough for now. John poured himself a cup of strong coffee, the steam curling into the morning air, and glanced at the man in the bed. He didn't know what would come of this, whether the leader would live long, enough to tell his story, or whether John's act of kindness would one day cost him. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had done what was right, and somewhere out there John knew the prairie kept its own kind of memory. The morning after that long, tense night passed slowly. John Mercer kept to his chores, stepping in and out of the cabin every so often to check on the wounded tribal leader lying in his bed. The man's breathing was steadier now, and though his face was pale beneath the paint, the fever hadn't come, a small blessing. John had seen enough wounds in his time to know that surviving the first night was half the battle. He gave the man water, a bit of bread soaked in broth, and changed the bandages before stepping outside to tend the cattle. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted, bringing the smell of rain from the west. The clouds on the horizon were thick and heavy, the kind that promised a short, hard storm. John was stacking extra firewood by the cabin when he heard something unusual. A rhythmic pounding in the distance, faint but unmistakable, hoofbeats, many of them. He straightened, squinting toward the far ridge. At first the riders were just dark shapes against the sky, moving in a swift, unified formation. As they drew closer, the details became clear. Painted ponies, feathers whipping in the wind, the sun glinting off spear tips and rifles. There were at least a dozen of them, their presence carrying the weight of purpose. John's hand went instinctively to the Colt on his hip, but he didn't draw it. He knew the man inside his cabin had people, and these riders might very well be them. Still, a dozen armed men could turn the tide of the day in any direction they pleased. The group slowed as they approached, fanning out in a semicircle about 50 feet from the cabin. At the center was a tall man riding a striking paint horse, his posture straight and commanding. Even from that distance, John could see the resemblance, the same strong cheekbones, the same unwavering gaze. John stood on the porch, his face unreadable. The tall man dismounted and walked forward, hands visible, a gesture of peace. Behind him, the others stayed mounted, silent and watchful. "You are the one who helped my father," the man said in clear, accented English. John nodded once. "Found him down by the creek bed. Would have been dead before sunrise if I'd left him there." The younger man's eyes held steady on John. "In our way, a life saved is a bond that cannot be broken. My father lives because of you." From the corner of his vision, John saw movement. Another rider dismounted, a woman, and slipped past into the cabin. Moments later she emerged, speaking quickly in her own tongue. The younger man's expression softened at her words. "He rests, he will heal." John crossed his arms. "Good to hear. You rode all this way to tell me that?" The man's lips twitched almost into a smile. "No, we came to honor you." At a signal from the leader, 5 of the riders moved forward, each leading a young woman on foot. They were dressed in soft deerskin, adorned with beadwork and feathers. Their hair was long and black, their faces painted delicately, their eyes lowered. In quiet respect, John's brow furrowed. "What is this?" The leader stepped aside so the women could stand before John. "A gift," he said simply. "Each one from a good family, skilled in the ways of our people, cooking, sewing, tending to the home. In our tradition, this is the greatest thanks we can give to a man who has shown great honor." John's mouth went dry. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but this was something else entirely. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You do not refuse," the man said gently, but there was weight in his voice. "To refuse would mean you wish my father's life had not been saved, that you do not value what we value." The wind shifted again, carrying with it the first scent of rain. John glanced at the women, then at the armed riders watching him closely. This wasn't just a matter of courtesy. This was a matter of respect, of honor between two very different worlds. "I'm just a rancher," John said slowly. "I didn't save your father to get anything out of it." "That is why you deserve it," the leader replied. "We do not forget kindness. The prairie remembers. The people remember." There was no malice in his tone, just a steady certainty that this was how it would be. John took a long breath, weighing his words. "I'll accept your thanks," he said at last, "and I'll take care of them while they're here. But understand, I don't own people, not in my way of living." The leader inclined his head, as if John's answer was acceptable enough. "They are not owned," he said. "They are given, free to leave or stay. But they will stay, for they will honor the man who honored us." The transaction, if one could even call it that, was over. The riders did not linger. They mounted their horses once more, their leader giving John a final nod before turning back toward the open prairie. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind. That left John standing on his porch with 5 women and a wounded tribal leader still asleep inside. He scratched the back of his neck, feeling like a man who'd just inherited a whole lot of trouble. "Well," he muttered, "suppose we'd better get out of the rain." The women followed him inside silently, moving with graceful precision. One began tending the fire without being told, another started sorting through John's modest pantry, and a third fetched fresh water from the barrel outside. It was as if they had already decided this place was now their home. John busied himself by checking on the wounded man. The leader was still sleeping, his breathing even, a faint color returning to his cheeks. The storm broke soon after, rain drumming against the roof, wind moaning through the cracks. Inside, the cabin was warm and filled with the faint scent of sage and smoke. For the first time in years, John's home didn't feel empty. That night, over a meal richer than anything he usually had, thanks to the women's skill, John sat quietly at the table, trying to wrap his mind around the day. The leader's son had been right about one thing: the prairie didn't forget. Out here, kindness was a currency rarer than gold, and once given, it could come back to you in ways you'd never expect. As the fire burned low and the storm eased, John looked at the faces around his table. He didn't know what the future held, whether the women would stay a week, a year, or a lifetime. But for now, in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, he understood something he hadn't in a long time. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest gift of all.